Just like that. It feels like nothing's changed, but all of a sudden we're live. So we're here with Tessa and Hanwakan. I got that right again.
Perfect.
Whitecloud. Tessa, you're the executive director of One Just City, which focuses on loving the underloved, working toward reconciliation, growing individual capacity, and building inclusive communities. Hanwakan, you are the executive producer at Wakan Productions Incorporated, where you direct and produce documentaries focusing on the profiles of urban Indigenous people, a community mentor and leader, and work to create an identity for yourself outside of stereotypes and barriers. And together, I like this as part of your bio, as a Dakota man and settler woman, they're as committed to a Canada free of hate as they are to sustaining the love that they have between one another. So I really enjoyed that. And so maybe to start us off, Tessa, how does One Just City support the underloved of Winnipeg, and what programming is supported by it as well?
So One Just City really tries to offer what a family would offer to somebody, so that love and kind of wraparound support. So that looks like 3 soup kitchens that serve over 700 people every single week. But in that, it's sort of like that first place that you connect. So from there, volunteers, we have volunteers whose job is like to go and listen to folks and chat with them while they eat, and then figure out like, oh, well, Susie's like hasn't had a shower in 5 weeks, and so we'll let her know that there's a shower program. Or, John was mentioning that he's like getting an eviction notice, but it's for something you can't get evicted for, so we'll let him know about our advocacy program. So it's sort of those first steps. And so for a lot of folks, they might come in because they're hungry, but they leave having extra support and friendship and community. And so we really try to be that place where people can come kind of for whatever they need. And so socks can be love, food can be love, a place to sleep. That's going to open in like a week, our overnight warming center. So we open that January 1st to March 31st so that people can come in and sleep inside in Osborne Village. We are sort of like love just looks like making sure someone has their basic necessities.
Where are these places located?
So we have 3 sites. We have St. Matthews, Maryland, and they're at St. Matthews and Maryland, so they're pretty easy
Makes
to find.
sense.
And yeah, that's what they're called, and that's where they are. That's our kind of West End site. They just did a huge Christmas store where families for $2 got to buy presents for everybody on their health card. So Santa often doesn't come if you live in poverty. And so trying to make sure that happens for folks, especially young little folks that are excited to see what's under the tree. And then we have West Broadway Community Services, and they're at Broadway and Furby. And then Oak Table, which has a bit of a different name than our other sites, which is the one in Osborne Village that shares the same space with our overnight warming center, Just a Warm Sleep. And Oak Table started because there's this giant oak table, it's still there. And they initially were like, people seem kind of like lonely and sad. We should offer coffee so people could come in and visit. And then it grew from there. And they see over 150 people now most days, which is huge.
That's amazing.
How did this all get started with One Just City?
So all of those sites were started by the United Churches that they're partnered with. And then they, initially were supported completely by those churches and other United Churches. And then the United Church was like, well, first of all, we're really focused on justice and we don't believe in evangelizing. So none of the services ever came with, but you need to learn something about God, right? Ever. So we feel like maybe people outside of the church would be behind this justice work. What if we created a non-for-profit that wasn't church-run that could help other people find out about the justice work that is happening in these sites and also support them? And so that's what birthed One Just City, so that somebody who does marketing could do marketing of that work, somebody who does fundraising could do fundraising of that work, and the volunteers that are passionate and the community folk who work in those spaces that are passionate about being one-on-one with people could just focus on being there with that person and helping them in the best way possible. So we're kind of an umbrella support to those smaller spaces.
Do you have any favorite stories of One Just City so far? I'm curious.
Probably too many. A favorite. Okay. So I think, I have favorite stories about the impact that our donors help us make, for sure. And one of those is actually the intergenerational impact that love can have. So we had a woman, I'm going to call her Lynn. That's not her real name. So we had a woman who came pretty regularly because she was hungry. And so she used to come for food. But we eventually built a relationship with Lynn, and we knew sometimes Lynn showed up with sunglasses on, but it was sunny out and now you're inside. Or sometimes she showed up and she wasn't, she was tendering an arm. And so we kind of figured out that Lynn was in an abusive relationship. And so, every day, like anybody who comes into the site, like, Lynn, we're happy to see you. How's it going? Some folks don't want to be talked to. We don't talk to those folks. If they're just like, I just want to eat and then be left alone, we're like, yeah, respect. But with Lynn, she wanted that conversation. And so she was supported by a volunteer quite a fair bit. They got to be friends, they chatted, and eventually Lynn said, there's this feeling that I get when I'm here. And the volunteer was like, okay, is it good? Is it bad? Is this? And then she's like, no, it's a good feeling. It's just weird to me. It feels like people are nice, and it's not because they want something back. And our I think it was our staff person said to Lynn in this context, because our staff get brought in if there's kind of more concerns happening. Said to Lynn, I think what you're talking about is love. Like, that's what love is. We love you here for sure. And love is being nice without wanting anything back. And can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Thank you for asking.
And Lynn was like, no, it's not love. Love comes with bad shit. It's not love. And then like a really long conversation happened with Lynn over the course of a couple of weeks about how like love doesn't actually come with bad shit. Like, that's something else. And then we didn't see Lynn for a while, which is super nerve-wracking because of the way that domestic violence, if someone tries to leave and doesn't manage to leave, can actually escalate, right? So we were pretty nervous. We'd asked a couple people if they'd seen her. And she got wind that we were asking and came back. And she said, oh, I hadn't been back because I moved neighborhoods. I moved out. I'm living on my own. I'm doing well. But seeing as I'm back, can you help me help my daughter to leave? Because I taught her to choose love that comes with bad shit. And I don't want my 4-year-old granddaughter to know that type of love or think that that is love. And so over the next like 6 months, her and her daughter came into our women's drop-in at that time and kind of did some of that work. And now all 3 of them live together safe of domestic violence. And like, that's huge.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's only because like people, like helped us keep our doors open at that drop-in, because there was a while where that was precarious. Like we're mainly donor funded. B, like, because a volunteer showed up regularly and built that friendship with Lynn, and that's how she spent her Wednesdays, like, was building that relationship. And so, like, that's huge and is, like, changing a family. And then there's, so that's kind of, like, a bigger, like, for me, every time I'm like, okay, another grant for, like, $3,000, I'm like, okay, but, like, that's changing one person's life for sure. And, like, a $50 donation helps us feed like 10 people, and that's 10 potential Lynns coming into the door for the first time, meeting somebody who's ready to love them.
Yeah. The themes of trust, love, and connection come up in that, and I think it shows you what it takes for somebody to maybe get past those certain times in their life, or even some of those toxic situations. So that's amazing that there's a place, there's resources, and there's people that do care about the underloved. And I love that term as well. It shows the impact that something like that can have on somebody's life too.
Yeah, and it's a term actually that our guests came up with. And some people don't like it. They're like, how are you saying someone else is not loved enough? And I'm like, well, because they're not loved enough. Like, because they're living outside right now in -30. Like, that's not someone who's loved enough. I have enough family and friends around me that they would rally, right? And that would be figured out. But for people that don't have that here, maybe they have it somewhere else, but who don't have it here, like, they don't have that opportunity. And so when I first got this job, I was the first staff at One Just City, so it didn't really exist before I started there. But I was asking at our different sites, like, what do you come here for? And one guy I asked, what do you come here for? And he was like, to check in. I was like, okay, what does that mean? And he's like, don't you check in with your family? Like, what do you mean? What does it mean? And was like, really like, gave me like that disappointed look and was really stern, like, anyways, when your parents are going to ground you, like, you gave me that face. Don't you check in with your family? And so many people said, like, I don't come here because I'm necessarily hungry. Like, yeah, I eat while I'm here, but like, I come here because this is where my friends are, this is where my family is, or this is where I feel welcomed and loved. Or one of our guests says, this is where people hug me, And so I didn't pick underloved, it picked us. But that's definitely who we're working with and who we want to be there for. And it also lets people that have all of this love come in and share that or find it, because the love is 2 ways for sure, right? Like, I get more hugs at work probably than I have at other jobs, like, collectively in my entire life in the last 3 years at One Just City.
So how did it start to then get to where it is now? Like, I know we sort of went to, you were the first staff, but then what was the process like and how did it grow?
So we had to get our own charity status and then like and be an incorporated body to do that. So there was lots of like kind of like legal stuff, but I think it was really mainly about like getting our name out there and getting people to understand. Like once there is a just city in Winnipeg, like we'll all quit. Like that's the goal, and that's why it's in our name. Like that's the vision. And then initially we did like, okay, what are the things that we all have in common? So we all want to love people where they're at, offer them what they need without judgment in an inclusive space. We all are committed to reconciliation, and reconciliation for folks who can't, just read a book in the safety of their own home about it or watch First Contact on their couch, but reconciliation for folks that may have been cut off from their own indigeneity or, have never heard about that and don't have the opportunity to learn about it. So really building Indigenous and non-Indigenous connections in the sites and in the space. And then we also want to watch people grow, like people like Lynn, right? So grow themselves into enough self-love that they decide to not accept a situation they're in or grow their capacity to be able to do more for themselves or maybe work. But it's not always about you have to, at the end of this, kind of end up at work. And all of that only takes place if you have an inclusive community, right? Like none of us can actually do that alone. So all of that happens in community. And so how do we build those inclusive communities? So we did this strategic plan and came up with those kind of core pillars that we had in common. And then Santiago Tovar volunteered and did our logo to represent kind of all of the 4 charities coming together as one on these 4 pillars that we're focused on. But it's really just been a labor of love and a labor of tons of volunteers. Like we have volunteers who completely ran our overnight warming center the last 2 years, like unstaffed. It was like I showed up sometimes, but mainly it was volunteers, including Hanwakan, that made that happen. And then, a lot of like, hey, let's do this little event or this little talk and like kind of see what flows. But really about just like, what do we have in terms of capacity to try to offer people what they need? And then let's figure that out. So Michael Champagne tweeted us at One Just City about having churches open their doors so people could sleep inside. And we were away for Christmas and we got back and I like called a meeting of the church that I thought was the best site for that and One Just City and was like, I want to do this and I want to do it in 9 days. Let's figure it out. And they were like, okay, what about these questions? I was like, okay, well, this, like, we kind of like broke it down, like, how do we make it happen? And so both Augustine United Church and One Just City's boards, like, went through all of the potential issues. And then, like, in the next 2 days, like, looked at, like, figured out all the answers to those issues. And then in the next 2 days, met again and voted. And then we opened in, like, 5 days.
That's crazy. Like, those things like that I feel like in most cases take like weeks,
eons.
Months, years even to iron that out. So to be able to do that in 5 to 9 days, that's incredible.
And it was just like, how do we get out of our own way? There's people dying, sleeping outside, right? And so, and we haven't solved it, and there still is, and there's still not enough beds. But like, what is it that we can offer? And so because we're so small, it's kind of easy to get out of our own way and just kind of figure out what that looks like. But it's also like, so then last year we had no mats. So then we crocheted them out of plastic. And then someone heard that we were doing that and donated all the mats we needed. So, but it's just been a lot of like, like asking the community or doing little community things and then seeing who's going to like rise up and love people with us. And so far Winnipeg's loving.
Awesome.
Funny to see when you put something out there, how people, like-minded people, start to gravitate towards it too.
Yeah. Do you find that you have a sufficient amount of volunteers always volunteering, or are you always looking for more?
We're always looking for volunteers. We're always looking for donors. So part of it is that even in the years that I've been there, we've seen like a 50% increase in numbers at all of our sites, or like our emergency food program. So that's a program where families who are experiencing hunger as a result of poverty, typically. So say they get a food box from Winnipeg Harvest through our food bank on Monday, but it's Thursday and they've run out, they can get emergency food until Monday. So they get like a kit for 4 days. We never used to run out in that program, and we're running out every other month right now. So we gave over, I just wrote this down at home, but it's not there. 1 second. I know that we served in the last year, we gave out over 4,800 kits, and half of those were to families with children. So like lots of people. And so that's like in a thing we're seeing that growth. So like I hope that there's a day where we don't need more volunteers and more donors because we're seeing a reduction in the need of the services. But right now, because everything is increasing in need, we're also increasing in need in terms of the people who make the work possible, because we're just a vehicle for you to be doing good in the world.
Yeah. On our last podcast, we actually had a discussion about, Manitoba is what the second biggest in terms of volunteering, right?
Yeah. Well,
percentage-wise, yeah.
We're the second highest.
However, apparently a large, and I didn't know this until we had Margot Miller on our last podcast, that most people don't volunteer because they're not asked. So people are waiting to be asked.
Please come volunteer with me at One Just City anytime. I'm ready. We have options.
So in that sense, so people who want to donate or people who want to help out with the cause in terms of volunteering, who can they contact? Where can they go?
Yeah, so onejustcity.ca. So it's the number one, JUSTCITY.ca. And there's like a I want to volunteer donate button, and you can fill out either of those or both of those while you're at it. And then that would get sent to me and our volunteer coordinators. So depending on what you're looking to do, then we kind of fit you in. But we also have people who like offer skills that we aren't necessarily thinking about. So last year we had somebody who said, I'm really looking to produce a commercial because I need one for my portfolio, but I don't want to do one about like a product like that doesn't need it. Why don't I do it for Just a Warm Sleep? And so they did a 60-second commercial for us about what Just a Warm Sleep was that was geared towards people being aware of it and maybe donating. But it isn't something that we have no budget for that. There's no way that would have happened if that person hadn't offered it. We had another group who was a family, and they said, we're really looking for a way that we can volunteer together. But like we have a 4-year-old. And I was like, that's cool. Do you want to make thank you cards with your family, like at home? And I'll like tell you what to write on them. And then you can hand those in, and then I'll obviously like do the confidential information stuff. But like a 4-year-old making it, like we have tons of 4-year-olds at the drop-in. So like that's a really cool. So it's also like, what is it that you're bringing? And then if you're looking to develop certain skills, whether that's frontline work or kitchen work or overnight emergency stuff, like we've got tons of other roles that you can just step into too.
Perfect. There we go.
That's great that you can match people with their skill set or what they want to get out of that. I think that's super important for volunteering as well. But then you brought up video, and so I think I'll pass it to Hanwakan. And so
he's volunteered to make a lot of our videos. It's really nice.
Or voluntold.
Yeah.
Voluntold.
That was the word of 2015 for me. It was voluntold. I didn't know that existed as a word until it was like, you're doing this. And it was like, okay, but like politely say it. But no, so I wanted to know what inspired you to get into film. And what stories have you been telling through Is it Wakan or Waka production? Wakan.
Yeah, so
like
go. The Dakota, so my name, Hanwakan, the ends are kind of silent, but just like a little bit because it's Dakota, and in Dakota it means Northern Lights. Yeah. Yeah, so how I got into media was skateboarding, like skateboarding with your brother. And, but eventually, I wanted to tell our stories, right? So, I don't know, your brother's story, was very interesting to me too when I was interviewing him for another project, and that was just one for my friend's project at Red River College. We just had to make the story about cats. But my cat and dog were fighting, and I was like, who'd be a perfect, the voice for the dog would be your brother. Because he's such a character, right? But in that process, I interviewed him, and he told me the story of when he was arrested for skateboarding through. Yeah, and he broke down and started crying, and I was like, whoa, I've never heard that story. I've never had the opportunity to ever hear those kinds of stories. So how could I take that a step further and bring skateboarding and maybe branch myself out, which I'm doing now, but tell those stories in a way that I just find meaningful and also exciting, right?
Yeah. Well, it seems like so you've been telling a lot of skateboarding stories, and then you recently finished a cross-Canada documentary on powwows as well.
Yeah, that was super awesome.
He's still finishing it.
Finishing.
Oh, yeah, right before I got here.
He was working on it as we were getting ready to leave.
So what's that process been like, and maybe what did that entail?
Well, it was different from the last one, because the last one was about the reserve, several of the reserves in Manitoba which have skateboard parks, and then interviewing individuals in the community and just, analyzing their situation and what kind of makes up the cultural identity of the community, as well as, how skateboarding does too, right? But then with the powwow one, we had already written scripts, I had pre-interviewed, individuals before we went to the reserves, but with powwow, it was just showing up and being like, hey, you look interesting, please tell me your story, right? And so some people were like, yeah, my first time at a powwow, I'm Indigenous, but my mother never wanted me to express myself as being Indigenous because that was just looked at as bad, like as being something bad and something you weren't supposed to be proud of.
Those were young people too.
Yeah. This was like 20-year-old girl saying that. Another guy says, like, look, I was adopted out of Hanwakan, which is a community on the East Coast there, and he was just saying, like, I was taken out of the community, but now I'm coming back, and this is my way of coming back is through expressing myself through powwow. Yeah, and then, or if you go to the Wendake, which is the community in Quebec, like for them, it's a very big tourist thing, right? So they're located in Quebec City, but they're a natural urban reserve. So the city grew around their reserve, right? And so they're just like, yeah, they had like this big tour bus, and it was splashed with like a big, hashtag Wendake with someone like a powwow dancer, right? And I've never seen that before, like in my life, and I was just like, whoa, like you guys know what's up. But then, like if you go to the East Coast with in Newfoundland, like for them, they are adopting powwows, right? So powwows were traditionally a prairie activity for the Dakota, and for them, like they were like, yeah, well, powwows were happening across Canada, and we just saw it as an extension of our gatherings, which were called Maui Omis, which was because they're Mi'kmaq people, and they used to just gather and celebrate, right? But then they were like, well, we could celebrate, but in a different way that would attract more non-Indigenous people, and they could, we could all spend time together and communicate, really, right? And collaborate, and we'll just be a better community. Yeah, but then you go to Kamloops, and like Kamloops has like the sickest arbor in Canada. So an arbor is just like the stands of the powwow, but for them, they have like this cedar one, and it's like got lights, and it's got like statues, and it's just amazing. And like they had an amazing breakfast. I was just really pumped about the breakfast because like usually powwows, like they're kind of like you get your Indian.
Also, you're big on breakfast.
Yeah, well, I'm huge on breakfast, but you get like just your kind of Indian tacos or just burgers or whatever. But this was like a full on breakfast. Anyway, so that was really amazing. And then with Winnipeg has like a powwow community that's just like just growing. Like this one young lady, her name's Shanley Spence. She started doing powwow fit, so it's like classes. They're kind of like
they're like Zumba.
They're like Zumba, yeah, but Nietzsche-fied is how she described it. And so it's a way for individuals just to come and get exercise. But for some of them, like this one young lady, she came and said, look, like I was adopted out, and I want to get back to the culture in some way. And I just thought this would be a good way to do that because I have a daughter and I want her to get involved in the culture, right? So yeah, so this project has just been amazing, super amazing.
So what does a traditional powwow entail? Like what is the process like with that?
Well, usually, like the big part of it is like grand entry, right? So that's when all the participants. What?
Take your hand on the table.
I think it's natural to express.
All the participants prepare to be introduced to the powwow, like the dignitaries, right? So like you'll have a lot of politicians or a lot of Indigenous leaders. They'll be participating, and then so they're then you'll have drum groups that are all over, and so there's a key piece to that, and that's the powwow MC. The powwow MC basically is like the performer at the powwow, right? And so in Winnipeg, the individual I interviewed, his name was Coco. His name's actually Ray Stevenson, but he goes by Coco. And for him, he's just like, yeah, it's powwow time. Or he explains like kind of like what, how certain ceremonies came about, right? And so you have the powwow MC, and he says, okay, we'll introduce everybody, and then the grand entry happens, and the drummers are hitting it, and then from behind the dignitaries come the dancers, and it's just like the biggest, like in some cases, it's just amazing because there's just so many dancers, there's just so much energy, and then then there's competitions. There can be competitions, right? Because some powwows offer money, others are just for expressing different dances. So there's traditional, there's all these different types of dances, right? And so yeah, so then that's what the powwow is about. And then you eat and you have a good time, and yeah.
So when is this documentary? When is it supposed to be coming out, or do you have a date yet?
We don't have a date, but I'd estimate probably around February, March.
Is there a name for it, or
it's called "Living by the Drum: Canadian Powwows." Yeah.
So I wanted to know a little bit more about, especially the role that skateboarding has played in your life, but then also how you've been able to form identity through both skateboarding, like in terms of the urban indigenous community, how skateboarding's entailed in that and involved with that, and then also how powwows have helped you form that identity as well.
Yeah, sure. So growing up in the south of the city, there weren't many Indigenous people that I connected with, right? So going to high school, like I didn't really but I had a sense that I wanted to connect with others like myself. And skateboarding, I saw there were other, especially like on YouTube, like when YouTube first came out, and we were sharing like I don't know. I guess you describe it as sharing stories, right? Like, check out these sick tricks like that are happening in the North End, or check out these sick tricks that are happening in Transcona. So I saw certain individuals doing it, and I just reached out to them. And that, I think maybe like Facebook was around that time too, so it was much easier to connect, right? Or even sending messages through YouTube and just saying, hey, like we should like hang out and like let's create some videos together. And then people were very responsive to it. And then I said, well, let's create our own Indigenous skateboard team because I've never heard one, right? And so we had one for a while. It was called Red Riding Media. It made 2 R's and an M, just like that. I thought it was super cool. Other people did too. But then from there, like skateboarding just became more of a practice and more of an exercise that I really saw resonated with a lot of people and just kind of brought them on a good path, right? And so I wanted to make sure that people had more opportunities to engage in skateboarding and that more demos were happening. And like, and a lot of people don't know that Winnipeg has like the most skate parks per capita of any Canadian city, right? Like, that's incredible. And then even rural Manitoba, like Winkler has like my favorite skateboard park in the province. And I actually I emailed the mayor of Winkler and I was like, hey, like, you know, great job on like investing in the action sport, in the action sport infrastructure for your youth. And he was like, oh, God bless you. Nobody thanks the mayor. And I was like, right on. Yeah. But I forgot the question. What was the question again? How did I get into
Basically,
Identity skateboarding.
Oh, identity. Yeah. Identity. Yeah. So identity. So another piece. So we started the skateboard company, but then originally I wanted to have a skateboard television show and a skateboard shop, and that was because there was a show developed by a skate shop in Montreal called Underworld, and that's what they did, right? They had a skateboard shop and a TV show, and I was like, that sounds like you're just having the best time ever. Like, how can I do that for myself? And so I wanted to create a skateboard TV show, so I wrote up a script, but it was much harder to get into because I myself had never had professional training, right? And so that was, I had to get a mentor for that one. And then the identity piece for me was also, in my research for that script, I found out that the National Smithsonian Institute in Washington had an exhibit called Ramp It Up. And Ramp It Up was an exhibit that explained how Indigenous skateboarding and snowboarding and surfing are indigenously inherent Indigenous practices because they were born out of surfing. And the first surfers were the Polynesian people of Hawaii. So the idea of using a board to explore your environment and live in a good way and mentor each other is born out of indigeneity, right? And so I was like, yeah, like that's awesome. Like, and you could even see it too. Like, it's not a competition, right? Like, it's people like seeing other people and being like, hey, you know, you could probably do that, or just pushing each other, right? And so I found that to be super supportive, and I just think that more people should get into it, right? Yeah, especially in the Indigenous community.
I can relate to that story on a lot of different levels. I think in my personal life, I know my brother would probably have a very similar story on just like forming his identity and finding skateboarding. For me, football was always the constructive place to put my energy. I felt like, I think as a male sometimes in the world, like growing up, you have that aggressive energy and you want to have somewhere constructive to put it. And whether it's a creative or an action sport endeavor like skateboarding or snowboarding, or whether it's hockey or whether it's football, there's a lot of these different pursuits, but it's great to find the one that speaks to you and the one that you really engage with. And then the other side of it is I've found obstacle course racing. And so in a similar way of exploring your environment and just the sense of like both play and I would also say almost that one-upsmanship too, where you want to be able to do the thing that other people do. So the one thing that I'll share is that a bunch of guys love doing handstands, and they can do them and they can go all the way from the ground and up to a handstand. And then I went, well, I want to do that, so I'm going to start to learn the process on what exactly it takes to be able to get up into a handstand and be able to keep it. So I think it's cool that there's all these different and new ways to just move and to engage with the environment. And so I can relate to that in terms of skateboarding, but obviously in a little bit different a pursuit. But
yeah, for sure. Well, then we took that a step forward in that when we were skateboarding, like specifically on like private property, like when people were kicking us out, I'd be like, yo, like, you know, let's talk about, you know, Indigenous settler relations here. And a lot of people were like, nah, you know, no. But this one guy, like I got him really good. And it was out when we were skateboarding outside of the Manitoba Hydro building here when it was just being built. And apparently I heard that like, it was designed so it wouldn't be like, you know, good for skateboarding. It was perfect for skateboarding. And anyway, so we were skating and this dude came out and he was like, hey, you know, you got to leave, you know. And I was like, yeah, cool. Like, we're going to leave in like 5 minutes. Like, you know, we're going to go skate on. And he was like, no, you have to leave right now. And I was like, no. And he was like, no, like, don't you know who do you think paid for all this? And I was like, well, like I know Manitoba Hydro, like, goes to Indigenous lands, takes, their resources and then doesn't give anything back to the community. So as an Indigenous person, I have the right to be here. And he put up his hands and he turned around and walked away. And I was like, that's right. Like, you got nothing. Like, I'm right in this case, right?
Yeah.
And so then just talking about my friends and like my other Indigenous friends and just talking, and then it opened up opportunities to talk about, like our shared history, right? The treaties and other things. So, yeah. So it just opened up more opportunities to communicate and understand each other. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So what do you both seek to achieve through your efforts within the community, business, and film? Either one can go first.
What do we seek to achieve? I think, like, ultimately, for me, it's where's the place where I can use my skills the best, sort of, to try to make, Winnipeg or wherever I am, like a better place for the most people possible. And so, for me right now, that looks like One Just City and also teaching at the University of Winnipeg. But like, how do we kind of put ourselves forward at our work or in our volunteering or in our play, like skateboarding, to like put ourselves out there in a way that makes the community better, but also like keeps us feeling like our cup is full so that we can keep doing it. And so I would love to see a city where no one was hungry and all are cared for and everybody has enough. And I'm working towards making sure that until that's a reality, the people that don't have those things still know that they're loved and that somebody's there to make sure that they have what they need for today at least.
I just really want to communicate better and just like emphasize that communication is key. Like, I'm really stoked on what the work you guys are doing here, and I think it's super awesome. And communicating brought me to this young lady as well too. So on our first date, I was like, yo, like I have 143 questions I got to ask you, like, including like, when would what would be your ideal vacation?
Date.
Like, when do you want to have kids? Like, and then after
Bust
that,
out the notepad.
yeah, after that, I was like, like, awesome. Like, what are you doing later? Like, let's keep going. And here we are today. So, yeah.
Well, that's amazing. So I guess I'll skip forward. There's a million and one things, but so you two got married at the Forks and had a public ceremony.
Yeah.
So maybe
8 months after we met.
8 months after you met. So maybe how did you meet? How was that ceremony like? And did you think it was fitting as well to be married at the Forks, a traditional trading and meeting place, and where the Red River and Assiniboine rivers meet?
Yeah, that for sure was part of the thinking.
Yeah, totally.
So let's answer the Forks piece first, because I think it was funny. So we were like trying to figure out where to get married. We knew that we wanted our dinner at Adrenaline Adventures so everyone could go ziplining before dinner.
Rest in peace.
Yeah, rest in peace at Adrenaline Adventures. And Yannick. But yeah, so we knew that we wanted to have that there, but we're like, we don't want the ceremony there. And Dakota tradition is a public wedding ceremony. And so we also knew we wanted a place that could like have a lot of people. We both have big families. And so we were like thinking about it and then both went at the same time to each other. Are you thinking the Forks?
Well, I was thinking for skateboarding, right? I was like, it's got to be near a skateboard park.
Yeah, and it had to be near a skateboard park. That was the thing, because there's pictures of me on my wedding dress, in my wedding dress on a skateboard. So we're like, are you thinking the Forks? Kind of at the same time. And then they were like, okay, well, we have a date like in 4 months. We just gotten engaged. We have a date in 4 months, or we have a date in a year and a half. And we're like, okay, let's get married in 4 months. Let's figure it out.
How long ago was that?
3 years.
Wow.
Yeah. So my dad is a United Church minister. And then Hanwakan's mom is a Dakota elder. And so they actually planned our ceremony together and did it together. And so it kind of tied both Dakota tradition and United Church tradition. And then, had our own flair to it for sure.
Yeah.
That's such a cool story, though, in terms of like the fact that you met and you had this ceremony and had invited public into it, and just like, I don't know, I really enjoy that it was a new tradition and something a little bit different than the city's scene, and even like reading about that article and things in the paper.
But it seems so fitting at the same time. So very neat.
Yeah, and very much so. Like, I think we like obviously love hanging out with each other, but we also love like being involved in our community, and so we wanted our wedding to reflect that. Part of our marriage is about looking out into the community and doing good things there. But actually, we met at a conference, kind of boring. But then I asked to walk out on Instagram.
right when they got direct
modern
messaging.
dating.
Slid into his DMs.
Oh, exactly.
Exactly. That's what I did. Yeah. And it was before you could just send a note on Instagram. It was like that, right? You had to send a picture. So I wrote like a note of like, hey, we should hang out. And I sent it as a picture with my phone number.
And she was like, is this a meme? And I was like, nah, but we'll still hang out.
Yeah. We've been talking about memes at the conference. Yeah. So I was doing the marketing for a conference on mental health for youth. And Hanwakan was there for his new job. And and then our date, that was like Thursday. And then that really long date was on Sunday.
The 143 questions.
Yeah, for sure.
So one of the things that you shared that bonded you was conversations around reconciliation. So how do you feel Winnipeg or even the province of Manitoba is progressing in terms of reconciliation, valuing diversity, and building unity within our city?
Great question. So I know CBC still has like a functioning website that shows you like how the recommendations or the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation have been followed so far or have been completed. And I think like 10 out of the 94 recommendations have been filled out. So like we're getting there. But there's still a lot of things to do, right? And I think Winnipeg's doing a good job, but like eventually, like we're just focused on reconciliation. And I think a lot of the people who have access to reconciliation type workshops or opportunities are those who probably don't need it as much as like the community does, right? And I think we're also going to eventually get to a place where we have to talk about restitution, right? And we're not even there yet. And I know a lot of people want to get there immediately.
Explain what that is, because we're not there yet.
No, would you?
Oh, sure. So reconciliation is a good way to start when you're explaining restitution. But reconciliation is this idea that there's a relationship that's broken and it needs mending and repair. And in order for that to happen, there needs to be sort of this truth process and a recognition of harm, right? So there's a recognition of harm from settler people to say, you know, like even though they weren't like my choices, the choices that privileged me as a European settler here, you know, those harm Indigenous people. And I benefit from that harm. And so that's reconciliation, right? Is that awareness. And then restitution is the, okay, so how do we make sure that, for example, Indigenous youth have enough access to mentors and programming that they can believe that they can be anybody. And then when they go into workplaces, they don't face racism, so they actually have opportunities to be anybody or kind of have any profession. So it's about like, so here's we've recognized the harm. Now, how do we undo harms like racism and prejudice or poverty, because that's another policy decision that affects Indigenous people. How do we undo those things? And then how do we try to make sure that we also support Indigenous people to be able to do all of that amazing healing work that they already know how to do, but just need more support to do. So restitution is about reconciliation. I recognize the harm. Restitution, I've figured out a long-term solution.
It seems very multifaceted in terms of, I mean, you have the structural side to it, and of course we have politicians, and we have laws, we have the Canadian rights. I'm trying to think of the
Canadian Charter for Human Rights.
Canadian Charter for Human Rights. But then it seems to be this trickle down, and it seems that on the individual level, there needs to be more done in terms of, I would say, education and connection. But I think this extends even beyond this issue. I think people have barriers between them more so now than ever before. I think, you know, things like phone and learning how to use this technology, and how is this part of life, and actually having these conversations part of life. So it's not to get away from the point, but it's there seem to be more barriers between everybody nowadays. And so how do we maybe educate people, but how do we get past some of those things at the individual level so we can come to a place of reconciliation and even connect once again?
Yeah, well, I think like Powwow is a good one. Like, and I think that was one of the ones that was pushed through the documentary. Like Errol Ranville, who's the singer of the Seaweed Band, which was the first Indigenous band in Canada to have a #1 hit, he wants to build like this $50 million like Powwow Arbor, just like Kamloops, but at the south point of the Forks. And he feels that like if there's a Powwow Arbor there, and like we can attract tourists from like from Europe or other countries, and they could come here, and they would not only would they go to the Powwow, but they would be driven down the Red River in these canoes, and like they would visit certain historical sites, but then they would end up at the Powwow site. And at the Powwow site, like there would be vendors, there'd be a teepee village, there'd be dancers, there would be like a concert venue area, and it would all be like an opportunity for everyone just to get together and just discuss and collaborate, right? And I think that's what's really needed, is just opportunities, like you said, to communicate and talk and collaborate. Yeah.
And I think like the best leader of that and making that happen in our city is Aboriginal Youth Opportunities with Mimi the Bell Tower.
How should I acknowledge the tragedies of the past, and then how should I live honestly and rightly in this day? Like, how can I be both? How can I have that guilt on the things that happen in these lands and still comport myself and be proud of myself and my heritage? I guess that's something I struggle with.
Yeah. So I am gonna butcher a quote from my brother, actually. But my brother, Daniel Blaikie, a member of Parliament for Elmwood Transcona, had an event, and it was an event to celebrate our Scottish heritage. So I'm Scottish and Ukrainian and a little bit Irish. And same thing, like I'm a 4th generation Canadian. I only have one grandparent who wasn't born here. I think, actually, maybe all of them. But anyways, so yeah, and he said, as we come together today to celebrate and honor Robbie Burns, anti-capitalist poet who's Scottish, and the work that he's done, and celebrate Scottish heritage, we do so recognizing that Scottish heritage has in part survived because of the oppression of some culture here. So we are still celebrating, so now I'm not quoting, and that wasn't a direct quote, but we're still celebrating our identity and recognizing that our identity has been given space and privilege. Right? Mm-hmm. And so as much as we recognize and celebrate who we are, we also try to give more space and more resources in order for Indigenous people to celebrate and recognize who they are, given that our cultural advantage was created by the suppression of their culture. Right? So for me, and the other thing I'd say, like, it's not necessarily that you need to feel guilty. Like, guilty is often a freezer. Guilty often doesn't let us do anything. And one of the best elders, Judy De Silva, who I had to work with out of Grassy Narrows First Nation before Hanwakan and I met on my master's thesis, said, like, guilt is making it about you again. Mm-hmm. So just don't bother. Instead, think about, like, how do I move forward? Just what you're saying. Like, how do I move forward? How do I take action? So, like, this is what I know about being Scottish. Tell me more about being in Dakota. Tell me more about being Indigenous. Tell me more about how these things mean to you. Or I know, like, I haven't done enough reading to understand what's happening today as a direct result of residential schools or a direct result of the reserve system, which was like a deliberate financial oppression, right? And still is. So how do I just get to know those things enough a little bit that I'm educated enough to calmly and kindly challenge a racist joke? How do I educate myself enough? Because someone else in that room shouldn't have to do it if they're the only Indigenous person, or there's no Indigenous people there at all. So how do I make sure that I'm holding that space in kindness? Because that's how people learn, right? Mm-hmm. How do I know that I know enough to figure out, does my workplace have a policy of trying to hire Indigenous people or trying to mentor Indigenous youth so that they know they could work here one day? Because they're going to self-select out of those things. And that process is called social annihilation. So it's where a young person is like, I don't have role models like that who are doing those things, so probably that's not for me. So a good example, my brother was like, hey, my dad's a politician, maybe I should be a politician. First I'll become an electrician. But, right, like, but lots of people pick people they interact with. So Indigenous youth are picking social workers and teachers, which is great, but that's because that's who their positive role models are. But what about business people? What about lawyers? What about... So is my workplace doing enough to make sure that Indigenous people feel welcome?
Yeah.
I like what you said about guilt, that it doesn't accomplish
I didn't say
anything.
It, but I repeated it really well.
But I that is true. I mean, instead of feeling bad and kind of making it about yourself, just the solution to that seems to be just open up the conversation and
educate yourself. Like take that time, and
exactly.
then just being willing to be uncomfortable and show up anyways, and create what space you can.
So, do you feel that our school systems or education systems do well enough to highlight this issue and actually inform youth or people of the city in general? On these issues.
Yeah, well, if I were to analyze it, like I'd be doing it from like anecdotal evidence, right? Because I haven't been in a classroom. But when I was in the classroom, like I remember the teacher going like, yeah, and then all the Indigenous people died, like right at the end of the lesson, right? And then everyone like looked at me and I was like I don't like, but I actually don't know, right? I don't know my own like story, right? And so like I can't provide like an opportunity to like educate you all when I don't know, right? So
You know now.
yeah, I know now, and I can do that, and we've done that. But I think like overall the system has to change, right? So for example, like when they're teaching about genocide, right? Like you don't often teach about like the Indigenous genocide that happened here, right?
They
Right?
do now.
They do now.
They do
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And I'd say I've seen a huge switch in this. So I've been teaching Introduction to Sociology, so first year level course at the University of Winnipeg for the last 4 years. And the first time I taught, like when we talked about residential schools, or we did like we read books on gang life, we do a bunch of stuff. But when we first started talking about like Indigenous people's issues, I remember people being like, "Who's heard of residential schools?" And like 10% of the hands going up. And this year I asked that question in my class, and only 10% of the hands were down.
Nice.
So like to me, that's they're not a perfect sample, but in terms of who's graduating and going to university, I think that conversation is starting to happen a lot more, and it is a part of our curriculum now, and so that's because of a lot of really amazing Indigenous people who have fought for it to be there. So I think that there's growth happening, but I think but if we talk about the last 4 years, everybody who graduated before that, it's how do we reach them? How do we have those conversations with them? So that they can better understand. And I think that's where we still need to do more. And so a lot of what Hanwakan and I end up doing in terms of like reconciliation workshops is going into workplaces and tailoring something for them. So we did one for investors group. So you do finance. Well, let's talk about some of the financial barriers that Indigenous people had put between them and their ability to be productive. And then what are the results of that today? Let's talk about, in terms of Indigenous people and accessing healthcare. So what is epistemic racism? So in our system of healthcare, how are some things like being delivered in a way that isn't culturally appropriate for Indigenous people to Indigenous people, and how do we work around that? So a great example of that is like childbirth. So like I think when a woman, never done it, got no plans, but like when a woman gives birth, they're allowed to have like 1 or 2, maybe 3 people in the room, depending on the size of the room. In an Indigenous community, like you might have 28 people show up at the hospital, and now you've asked a woman who's in labor to pick her favorite 3, as opposed to just letting them all in the room and figuring it out, right? And so just how is that like not culturally appropriate? And so we do a lot of kind of like tailoring to talk about what is the issue that you need to better understand in your workplace to be able to move forward in a good way. And it's pretty like fascinating, because for some people it's like their first kind of piece, and then for other people they're like, oh, I've like been reading on this on my own, or been doing this, and so often like the group brings a lot to the table too.
So in terms of yourself, how did you become educated in this matter? Like even speaking for myself, like I don't know a lot of the history because it wasn't taught back in schools. When you say something like genocide, what immediately pops in my head is World War II.
Right? Yeah, for sure.
Totally.
Definitely.
So
yeah.
I definitely don't know the whole story. I probably only know a very small piece of the story. So how did you come about, because you didn't know as well, right?
Yeah,
so how
yeah.
did you educate yourself in that matter?
I got privileged because I was dating a young lady at the time who was taking conflict resolution at the University of Winnipeg. And while she was doing her studies, she passed me this book, and it was called Since Predator Came by Ward Churchill. And it's like a collection of essays just about various Indigenous topics about the genocide that's happened. And the first one, I think one of the first ones, it's analysis of World War II and like the Indigenous genocide that's happened here, and using statistics that have happened in North America, like historical ones. And just reading it, I was just like just totally blown away, right? And like had no clue, and then like started reading more and more. And then for a friend of mine who started a skateboard company called Colonialism Skateboards, like each graphic tells this story of a different piece of colonial history. So for example, like there's one board, and it's just like a bunch of bison skulls, like hundreds, thousands of bison skulls. And it talks about how the culling of bisons was used to oppress Indigenous people so that they would eventually have nowhere to go except for maybe these refugee camps, which we'll now call reserves. And now we'll get them to sign away their land, right? When they have no food, and when they're they just don't have the resources with that they depended on, right? And a lot of people don't know that story. And he was fortunate to read a book, and it was called, do you remember the name of the book?
Give me a minute. You keep talking.
Anyway, he got an opportunity to read that book. So like, it's just sometimes you just get an opportunity like that, right?
Clearing the plains.
Clearing the plains, yeah. And then even has like a skateboard, and it like the on the graphic of the skateboard is just that clearing the plains, and then there's like the award that's won and the author, like super cool work.
I'll have to check it out, because it's definitely something I've always wanted to know more about.
Yeah,
but I
for
just
sure.
don't know. Like, I mean, I guess we have internet at my fingertips, but at the same time, like, where do I start? Like, what do I look up? What do I search for?
Yeah,
right?
McNally Robinson has a really good Indigenous section, like, and that's where I go sometimes, right? And like even like the there's like an introduction to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, like, and their findings, like that was one thing I read, and it just talks about each one of the calls to actions and why they came about, right? The historicizing of like why they've decided to call that to an action. Yeah,
I think of a lot of different. There was a book I read in, I think it was high school or even junior high, that was really impactful, and it was all about sort of the stealing and losing of identity and then trying to find it thereafter. And it was a book about Indigenous youth, and then sort of the tale of his life. I know there are two others, and there's a lot of similarities between stories, but The Invisible Man is another one that's about African American populations in the U.S. and through like the racist parts of the 1900s, and sort of the same thing, trying to find identity within the world and who was he. There's one more, and it's Chinua Achebe, and it's actually it's an African story about, and it's called Things Fall Apart, and it was actually about Faulkner's poem of the same name, and it's basically when the center falls apart, everything goes into chaos. And so they had the way life was and knew their place in society and knew what their customs were and knew their traditions and knew their stories. And very similarly, a colonial story, the white man came and it showed the shift in terms of, and they sort of came under the preface of bringing religion and bringing all sorts of good things. And yet people were dying and people were being converted to Christianity, or people were being converted to religion. And it showed maybe one of the most proud people, like one of the leaders of that tribe, and how it ends actually with the man committing suicide, and it just showed, and nobody would, I know this is really sad, but nobody would take down the body because that was the tradition in their culture. So it's like some things were so ingrained that even they wouldn't play part in that, or like they wouldn't do that. But it was just the way that it sort of painted the picture before, during, and after. And it was one of those impactful stories. And I'm sure there are ones out there, I wish I remembered the name of that book, but I think it's to understand that that's what happened in the past, and to be able to contextualize it that way and even have that education is so important, just in terms of being able to understand.
Yeah, and I think like one of the things, like, you can't be ashamed of not knowing what you don't know and weren't taught, right? And so it's about, how do I make choices now to learn more? And I think so much of what's happening in terms of colonization, like, I'm using the word happening, right? Like, so there's a lot that's happened, but there's so much that's happening in terms of colonization. And so how do we also kind of respond and be present to the ways that that's still going on, and figure out, for me, how can I leverage my privilege in order to try to undo some of that, or create a more equal playing field? Or how do we leverage our privilege together in terms of having had time to do that education for ourselves, to like then go out and have those conversations. And so it is really like, one person's story can illuminate it, but it's still very much so like what's happening right now. So Hanwakan has a friend right now who, should be focusing on graduating high school, and instead is finally in a safe home. And not because his parent isn't loving and caring for him, but just because, there's that cycle of residential schools, and then that cycle of poverty, and then that inability to be that present parent. And that's right now. And then we have Indigenous parents who are amazing parents, who are super there, but who are having their children taken away because they're broke. And they're broke because they're experiencing racism in the workplace, and they experienced racism as a student, because that happens a lot, that students are sort of written off because they're Indigenous, and so then they don't have the same opportunities to learn, they don't do as well. So how can we like recognize what's happening right now? And there's tons of amazing stuff happening right now to try to also like disengage those systems. And so one of the things we do at One Just City is we have an Indigenous cultural programmer who works at our sites with the non-Indigenous and Indigenous, especially Indigenous folks, but to do kind of cross-cultural education and cross-cultural learning. So how do I live in a good way? How do I connect with different Indigenous cultures, whichever one I might come from, because a lot of our guests were 60 Scoop survivors or residential school survivors who then lost connection to family. How do I make sure as a non-Indigenous person in the drop-in, I'm starting to do this learning? So we have a book club that reads reconciliation books, and one person reads out loud because not everybody's literate. And so there's all of these little things, and so it's figuring out sort of what is the thing that you can be a part of.
Yeah, and right now I'm actually working on a book just to give some exposition to Canadians about how growing up through colonization, how that's affected them. So, for example, it's actually just a book about my mother, but my mother's side of the family, which is the Dakota, right? So, originally, the Dakota, they would go down south for the winter, like any normal person would.
Yeah.
I kid.
I'm going right to Arizona right after this.
Yeah. So, but then during the summer they would come back up, right? But then they had to come up and stay back up because they were being hunted in the United States because of the colonization and the taking of their lands, right? And so, just talking about the history from then on and how they've had to deal with the Canadian government. So, for example, when they first came back, they had said, "Oh, we already signed treaties with everybody else, but you can get half, right? We'll give you half the land, we'll give you half the food, and that's our dealing." But then on top of that, now you're on a reserve and you can't leave it, right? And now we're meant to create you as agriculturalists, right? So now you're going to practice agriculture. Oh, now you're doing so well at agriculture that you're entering into other markets, right? But then Indian Affairs comes in and says, "Nah, man, you are not allowed to work with machines anymore, and you're not allowed to work together," right? And so creating any sort of wealth, and they would handle and before that they would handle their own wealth, right? They would invest in machines, they would invest in certain places, and they were doing well for themselves. But Indian Affairs would say, "Nah." And then even today, there's a company, there's a social enterprise called Build, and they would like to build solar, solar efficient homes, and also geothermal homes, right? That would be very efficient and pay for themselves way later, right? And Indian Affairs is no, because they want to have control over what happens. They want to have the say on what goes on, right? So they're not going to give them money to do these homes because they just want to have control, right?
And there's a housing crisis.
Right? And so again, it's still going on. It's happened, but it's still going on. And so, so this book, I'd like to introduce everybody to how it is or how it's been and how it still is happening.
And I think in the case of your mother, also show that Indigenous people are resilient through that.
Yeah, and she just needed an opportunity, right? So when I said I grew up in the South End, there weren't many other Indigenous people, and I was always well, how come? Why did this happen? And for her, it was a number of things, but one of the key pieces was she was one of the first people on her reserve to get a high school diploma, and she was able to do that because she was supported through a family in Brandon that boarded her, right? And then that same family also moved to Calgary and said, "Hey, if you ever want to come to university, you can just hang with us." And she was "Well, yeah." So then she went to the University of Calgary, right? And so she had that privilege and that help. And then while she was at the University of Calgary, there was an opportunity for Indigenous people to go study journalism in Ottawa. And so she was "Yeah, sure, I'll do that," right? And then she got to go to Ottawa and then got all these other opportunities. Eventually she met my father, and then they both wanted to go to law school.
She had a boss that fought for her to get to go to law school.
Right.
That's a letter because she was a woman and she was Indigenous.
That's another piece too.
She had someone who was "Well, I have privilege. Let me leverage it for you, and I'm going to make this happen." And that person made that happen, and now she's a lawyer. And so, so it is about that resiliency despite all of those barriers, and in that resiliency, also people, offering that little bit of opportunity.
Yeah.
Stories like that need to be told. So I'm glad that you're working on it because that's so impactful. I think it's beautiful to know that there are leaders within the Indigenous community, and there are people's stories and people that have been able to rise above all these sort of the structural racism and the fact. Did you say Indian Affairs is still a thing and still involved? And
it's not called Indian Affairs anymore either, but
I expected the name change.
But it's a historical thing. Yeah, oftentimes when we're talking, I'm well, let's use legal terms, and and she has to say Indian, and she's just
Yeah, don't.
I know. Well,
feel uncomfortable.
I know it's, and I think that's an important distinction too. It's learning the terminology and we've sort of evolved from that language usage to now using Indigenous, but Aboriginal was the term, and we've used all these terms, and it's getting to the
Hey, I still have a status as an Indian card, my Indian status card.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's strange that some of these things still exist under the old names and under these different things, right?
Do you have it with you? Yeah, you do.
Yes.
every other
Yeah,
card
yeah,
out
yeah,
there.
yeah. Yeah, I do. So like this is it right here, right?
Well, we might have to blur out all the info.
Yeah, for
Pick
sure.
it up
But
from a
like,
distance.
but one of the key pieces, like, and so like when my father was working at INAC, like this was his project, was to develop a secure identification program, right? Because people were just copying like status cards and trying to get, the deals or other opportunities, right? But
Which are few.
Yeah, which are few. But one of the key pieces was this, and this is meant to be a passport, so you could use it to cross
Really?
between Canada and the United States. Yeah, and the United States was like, yeah, totally. But Canada was like, you are not allowed to have that. And so this still sits here as like what could have been, right? And so again, Indian Affairs being like, nah, like it's not going to happen. Yeah.
That's crazy. I feel like there's so much progress that could have been made that's
sure.
not there because of that. Like
sure.
just because they wanted control over
Yeah.
it. That seems so crazy to
Yeah.
me.
Well, just imagine like trying to form government or just trying to do anything, and somebody's like, no, right? And you're just like, okay. And then people outside don't know anything about it, and they're like, why are you lazy? Like, how come you can't like help yourself, right? And then but we're trying to undo that right now. Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to know is who or what inspired each of you to be so involved in the community and make a positive impact.
You're making me go first.
Yeah.
So it's hard to like pick one thing. So I'm gonna pick two, which was hard too, but I'll do it anyways. So my grandma was a member of the UCW, which is United Church Women, and they saw their responsibility to do kind of all of the social and emotional care for the community that surrounded that congregation and others. So they like made cookies for events. They like catered funerals. If somebody had a baby, they did like a food chain, which like now there's apps for that, but this was before apps helped you do the food chain. And really kind of, it was with joy, how do I give of myself so that those around me are the best they can be? And so it's her leadership style in that I really just wanted to emulate. And then, my wrestling coach, so eventually that made me want to become like a doctor or something. And then my wrestling coach, because I'm an Olympic freestyle wrestler, my wrestling coach was...
I like you glossed right over that. Wait. Let's talk about that.
But my wrestling coach one time, him and I were talking about what I wanted to do when I grew up. And I mentioned wanting to become a doctor, and he was like, I think that's a total waste of your skills. And I was like, ouch. What do you mean, though? And he was like, you should just be you should be the person that sends 5 doctors. You should be like, you're a people organizer. So instead of being the doctor that sees those 500 patients, be the person that sets up a system so that a doctor goes and sees 500 patients and then do that another place and then do that another place. And so today, we're setting up for this coming, like the spring of 2019, we're going to do a spring into seeing. And we're going to set up optometrist opportunities for people that are living on the street and ask donors to give $80 to give somebody the ability to see, right? And like kind of coordinating. And I'm like, oh, you're really good at predicting the future. He also called it that we'd get married like before he even met Hanwakan. So, Corey's got power. But but yeah, and so for me, it was kind of those two things. And Corey, my wrestling coach, was like, I love wrestling. It's what I want to do with my life. How do I make wrestling a good thing for the world? And so we had a club team that was pay what you can. And, it was like my first experience of family outside of family. And we had like an Iranian refugee, and we had a guy from Jamaica who had been adopted here. And we had, like people from kind of all economic backgrounds. And we were this, family that traveled to wrestling competitions all over. And everybody's in a different weight and teaching each other different tricks and kind of learning those things. And so for me, a big part of it is, like Corey was really like, you could do something like that, but what is the skill set that you're already flying in? And how do you help that, how do you make that help others take flight?
That term family, I think it definitely resonates because it transcends, especially on sports teams and things, it can transcend even any identity because you spend so much time with each other. Yeah. You know the energy and work that you're putting in. Even gyms and things feel like that sometimes too. Sometimes you even go by your nicknames and you don't know each other outside of those nicknames too. But it's fun. Like it's great to just have that dynamic and be able to identify with so many different people in that context as well. So I did want to know the same question to you, Hanwakan. I went too far. So who or what inspired you to be so involved in the community and make a positive impact?
So I think that would be it'd just be like my parents, right? But then like beyond that, like in skateboarding, like there's always like this push of like helping like Indigenous people, and I'm always like, yeah, like you're like one of the first to like try and do that, right? So there's this online magazine called Jenkum, and like they interviewed like this young man who lived on the Pine Ridge Reservation, and like it's kind of mainstream for like Indigenous skateboarders, or even just skateboarders. And so for them to have an opportunity to read this, I was just like, yeah, right. Like, how can I do something like that? But in a different way. So yeah, so skateboarding.
Skateboarding.
Yeah.
It's funny the things that impact us and that we get involved with. So how do you see your paths continuing both with One Just City and with Wakan Productions? And what projects are you currently working on? I know that you had the one coming out in January as well.
So January 1st, we'll open our overnight emergency warming center. We have volunteers who do intake at night from 9 to 11 and volunteers who do wake up and clean up in the morning from 6:30 to 7:30. So hit me up if you're interested in that. But a big part of that this year, for the first time, we're going to have a housing coordinator. So we're actually going to have a staff person who's trying to see those people into housing by the time we close March 31st. So that's really an exciting project that we're working on. And then another piece that we're working on at One Just City is to try to have somebody who can do some food management. And so either like a volunteer who'd be interested in doing that or some sort of grant, because it's only like about 10 hours a week. But we get tons of donated food, but sometimes it's like really strange. Like it's like 200 pounds of kohlrabi. And you're like, I need to figure out how to use that. So we need somebody who's inventive, or like, a local restaurant chain that wants to like send their chefs over one day a week or something to kind of help us do that. So those are kind of two pieces that we're working on in terms of new stuff. And then really, like, I think though the core of our work is just that consistent being there and being a drop in space where people can become, a part of this community and feel safe and feel welcome. And so we're really just going to try to keep that up and hope that other people who do amazing work to try to stop people from needing that can continue that work.
That's great.
Thanks, love.
So what is life like beyond career and projects, and what are your favorite winter activities?
Ooh.
Oh, man. So many.
You're looking at me. Do you want me to talk?
Yeah.
Okay. So we snowshoe, we snowboard, we fat bike.
What's fat bike?
It's like a really fat tire so you can ride on snow.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Except you
had a
can't
name.
really turn super good. Or at least I can't yet.
And it's not good on ice. Like one time we were fat biking, I was like, yo, you should hit that ice. And like she's always just like, yeah, it's and like I was like, oh,
I hate it so
yeah.
hard.
And then I was like, okay, well I feel bad, so I'm gonna go like there's this big pile of snow. I'm just gonna go right at it and like just probably eat it, right?
You
And I went right over, and I was like, wow, these things are sick.
And I'm gullible. But anyways, yeah. So we love to be outside as much as possible, and then we're big hot yogis.
So I did want to know as well what the biggest personal obstacle you have each faced and how you were able to overcome it.
Cool. You're going first.
No, what?
I went first every time.
I know.
Your eyes did light up, so I feel like you have
Well,
an example.
no. But I was like, you got one, super good.
So
The wrestling.
Yeah. So I mentioned that I was a wrestler. So I'm an Olympic freestyle wrestler and provincial champion in 2006. But in 2005, I was part of the Canada Games team and represented Manitoba, and was also sexually harassed for the whole year. And so the person that I was supposed to bring that to was one of the people harassing me.
Oh, wow.
And some of the other claims, like there was claims that there was misconduct between my coach and another athlete and myself, which never happened, but they like investigated that. But the stuff we brought forward as athletes, they never investigated. And so it was sort of like this weird, like doing investigations when it was like politically advantageous for the people currently in power, as opposed to like when athletes said, hey, this is happening. Mm-hmm. So there really wasn't like a lot of opportunities. And one day there was actually like somebody who had a conviction of a sexual offense against minors, like coaching. And my coach, Corey, who I mentioned earlier, like called me and was like, if any, like none of my athletes are allowed to show up today. If any of you show up, you're off my team. Like, don't go. And so he wasn't the team coach for Canada Games, but he was like our team coach. And so none of us showed up. We got penalized for that, but whatever, it's just push-ups. But like, And so it just like was a really unsafe environment. But I loved wrestling, and I was already getting a lot of flack at home for like being so boyish and being in a male-dominated sport. And so I didn't feel like I could tell my parents what was going on, because they were like looking for a reason to not have to drive me to U of M from Transcona already. And so, yeah, it was a struggle. And I kind of just like was like, it's okay, Canada Games is going to happen. I didn't perform well at Canada Games, obviously under those circumstances. I did eventually like really beat the person who placed fourth, because I talked to my own coach before that last match, but I'd lost everything before that, so like didn't matter. But the next year I started having post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. So like being fearful about sleeping, being fearful about being certain places, being nervous that some of these like harassment allegations kind of like are intended actions by the person that had been harassing me were going to come true, and just like feeling like unsafe in my own skin. And so I'm really lucky because I got help like right away. So again, my coach, because I was still training with the club team, was like, "You're not you. I found a teen clinic. They have free counseling. You're going tomorrow instead of practice. My wife's going to come and drive you." And so that's what happened, and I got help. And in that process, decided that I wanted to sue Sport Manitoba for a lack of duty of care to a minor. And I did that, and I won. It took forever. And my parents, like, you know, were just super worried about it being like re-victimizing or like scary. And so they weren't supportive. So I like came up with the money at 17, and my brother signed all the legal documents until I turned 18. And then eventually I was old enough to kind of take it on myself, and I didn't win until 2011. But
A long process.
yeah, so 2005 to 2011, like that's a long time. But I got to sit down with Sport Manitoba's lawyers, and they were like, we've started like, and I'd written them a letter like in 2005 when it all happened, like, here's my intention, this is what happened, like, this is what I'd like to see revolved. And they're like, we started Safe Coach Manitoba, like, we started this, we're doing these things, like, this is how we're addressing the story you're bringing forward. And for me, I knew, like, on the team, like, I had it light because of who my parents were. They have some sway and some power outside of wrestling, but I had it light because I was sort of like regarded as somebody who had parents who probably would go to bat for me. And so I know that other female athletes had it worse, like a lot worse. And I know that they've had it way worse in other places. So for me, it was just like, how do I make that wrestling room safer? Because I love it and I'm going to keep coaching. I injured out in a car accident. But how do I make sure that I'm not setting up young girls to go, or young boys to go into a space that's going to disregard their sexual safety and their bodies? And so just kind of like making that fight happen, and did here. And I think, you know, it doesn't mean things are better 100%, but it means that they're better than they were, and like kind of continuing that battle and recognizing that, like, when we have something that happens to us like that, like if we have the resilience, and even sometimes when we don't, if we can figure out how to push to try to make a positive change for like the next generation, like just how important that is.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to yourself or other people what would you say to yourself during that time of that experience, if you could?
So I say this to my nephews all the time. And I don't know that it like necessarily applies to exactly what was happening in the wrestling room, but I'm big on your body, your choice. So like, hi, nice to see you. Could I have a hug? Your body, your choice. But just kind of like building in that like aspect of consent, and that like what's going on with your body is your choice. And like in a wrestling room, like things are personal, you're sweaty, you're already half naked, like it's awkward to begin with. But knowing that like, well, actually, like I don't need to, there's a move called a butt drag. Like I don't need to practice a butt drag with like a 55-year-old man I don't know. My body, my choice.
Yeah.
Right? So some of those aspects I definitely try to do now with young people. And they say that like that's one of the like key things that you can do with young people in terms of helping them know consent and know when someone's trying to take their consent away, so that they're better prepared for that situation. But I think another big thing that I would just say to people that are struggling with mental health issues is to get help now, that you deserve help no matter how much your brain is telling you that you don't, that everybody does, and that like recovery is not only like possible, but with help fast, it's probable. And so like I haven't had, I've had like symptoms here and there, but I haven't had intense symptoms or symptoms getting in the way of my everyday life in over Oh, I'm 30 in over a decade. That just happened recently.
Welcome to the 30s.
Yeah, welcome.
But yeah, and so just that that piece.
I just kind of wanted to add something onto
Yeah,
that.
for sure.
And in terms of like in both harassment and mental health, like if anyone is going through that, don't feel like you have to compare yourself to someone else and say, oh, well, they have it worse, so I don't deserve help.
Yeah.
You definitely always deserve the help, right?
Yeah.
Like, if you need help, you need help. It doesn't matter how bad the harassment is compared to someone else, right?
Yeah.
So I feel like more people need to be more vocal about that, especially when it comes to things like mental health and sexual harassment.
For sure. And like, just because somebody's mental health issue is worse than your mental health issue doesn't mean that you don't deserve the support or that having that support would then also mean that you're better prepared to support that person. Right? So if somebody you love is struggling with their mental health, I often see people say like, I don't know what to do. They won't get help. And I'm like, go to a counselor yourself. And they're like, but why? Like, I'm okay. Or like, oh, I'm barely anxious or whatever. Right? And I'm like, yeah, but like that counselor is going to help you work through your stuff and better understand their stuff. And then you'll be a better support for that person too. And I often talk about like counseling, like getting your car, like your oil change, like let a professional know what's going on in there every once in a while.
Yeah.
And kind of have that system to just reinforce. And sometimes it might just be going and then being like, yeah, you seem like you're doing a great job on things and like good coping tools, like come back if something else comes up, but just how do you make sure that you, first of all, just like understand that you deserve support and that the same compassion you'd offer to a friend who's struggling and the same validating of whatever issue it is, despite how small it might seem, like give that to yourself and go get that help.
Finding someone you can be open and honest to that issue about is really important too. So like a counselor, but even someone you trust and they can help in that same way. But obviously the counselor is the one that's equipped to help deal with those issues too. So it's finding the resources that are there to help
and
you.
so the Canadian Mental Health Association of Winnipeg, which is where I worked when Hanwakan and I met, that's why I was doing the public relations for that conference on youth mental health. So they have like a mental health resource guide that gets published for Winnipeg every couple years. And it's like all of the resources in the city, including like their phone numbers and what they're helping people with. And so you can go there and get one or you can look online. And so finding that help for someone or that you love and like knowing that 80% of people who live with a mental illness like work full time and lead successful lives because they're getting the right amount of treatment. Just like somebody living with diabetes or somebody living with something else. And so for me, that was coping strategies and breathing techniques. And, it's awesome that I got those things and being able to kind of talk out that fear and get to a place where I'm not fearful. But for others, that looks like medication, and that's just as legitimate.
Wakan?
Well,
Same question.
Well done on the name there.
Thank you. I got the soft end now.
Yeah. A couple things. One is managing anxiety. Like now that like we have the legalization of cannabis, like now you can get access to CBD, and like that's made a huge difference for me because like I'm a highly anxious person. Like even sitting here, like I'm just like still like flexing and I shouldn't be. So that's one piece. One was like not seeing my dreams realized in the way that I thought they would, like getting the TV show and getting the skate shop going. Like the skate shop just didn't make any sense with the current retail climate. Like Amazon just like kills it, right? Like everything's to your door in 2 days. So that piece isn't going down, but it's going in different ways. Like there's other opportunities arising from that. And then the other piece is like getting a TV show. Like that obviously didn't materialize either, but now I'm doing all these other media projects. And that's because in my search of a production company to help me do a TV show, I met this producer who eventually was like, hey, why don't we start a company together? And then I'll do the business side of things. You can do the filming and whatever and finding the stories, and I'll help you along the way. And so he's been helping me. And so that's the other half of Wakan Productions is this old guy named Gary Zubek. And he's provided like that expertise and that like experience for me to be taken seriously as a cinematographer and as a director. And so that's a huge piece. And it was lucky that I had those opportunities. And just like my mom had some opportunities in her life, like that's been a key piece for me. Yeah. And then also finding like a partner who I just thought was appropriate for me. And then like reading a blog that said, hey, if you want to get to know somebody, you should ask them these questions. And then like, putting up an interview and then interviewing her and being like,
Hanwakan dated a lot of people before he
Yeah.
hit me.
But then finally,
I like that you see it as an interview.
oh yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's a key piece. Like a lot of people don't see their relationships as almost kind of like business deals, but they are, man. And like there's a lot of like things that go into it, like family dynamics, like, you know, like just a ton. And so it's just easy to get those things all off the bat and kind of see like, are we going to click? 'Cause, like, obviously find you attractive, but like,
Thanks.
you know, do I find you intellectually attractive? Like, you know, are you thinking about your future? Like, are you thinking about like kids? You know, Yeah. Yeah, it worked out. Hey.
So, what can we learn from each of your stories? And if you could share a message with all Canadians or even the world, what would it be? Tessa, we'll go with you first.
What? No, I think
Yes.
okay, so if I could share a message with Canadians kind of about my own story.
In terms of what you're doing, or maybe to inspire.
I think each of us has a responsibility and an opportunity to figure out what we have to offer this world to make it better, and then figure out how to do that with passion while taking care of ourselves. And I think everybody should take that time to know themselves because they're worth knowing, and then figuring out what that looks like for them and then getting at it.
Absolutely perfect.
Well said.
Yes, and I would say
Ditto. No.
I thought of that, but I was like,
And
that's cheap
podcast.
though. That's cheap though. I think everyone should find out what like their values are, because I think a lot of people don't know what their values are, and when you're able to find out kind of what you value, then you kind of can communicate and figure out, you know, where your life should be headed. Yeah, I know that's pretty simple, but when you look into it a little deeper, like you'll find out kind of where you should be going.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Learn yourself and learn the path and figure out, it's that same thing. I think it's along those same lines of figure out the value that you can share with the world and then do that and break it down. It's always just follow the process. So how do people get more involved in the community and participate in making a Canada they believe in?
So I think we've definitely offered like some different opportunities. So you can go to Meet Me at the Bell Tower. You can go to a powwow in your community. You can come volunteer at One Just City and be there with those folks and offer them love. They'll offer it to you back. You'll both leave better than you were when you came. You can participate in your own community or your own kind of workplace around like, how do we talk about reconciliation? How do we make a better Canada together? What's our role? And you can take that time to educate yourself on your own. So that you know a little bit more either about yourself or about the, you know, Canada's history and context and current reality, and so that you know how to better engage in it.
Yeah, and if you have opportunities to offer other people, like just do it, you know, because
Yeah.
it makes such a load of difference to people, and it can change their world and their families' worlds too.
And it can be like as simple as like your story about the dentist.
Oh yeah, the dentist. Yeah, so I went to a new dentist, and he, you know, like the what's the lady who cleans your teeth first?
Dental hygienist.
Yeah, the dental hygienist. She was like, all right, now the dentist is going to come in. And then he like came in and he was like, hey, so you're Indigenous? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, cool. Like, what background? And I was like, Dakota. He's like, oh, sick. He's like, you know what? You should be proud of yourself and your people and, you know, everything that they've done. Because they were proud people once. And like, if you can get back to the culture as best you can, I think that'd be great. And that was the first time anybody in my life had ever said anything like that to me, right? And for him, it was just, you know, just whatever, just banter. But like, it had such a like ingrained feeling on me that I'm still sharing it to this day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Helping somebody even just in like that.
Or like Hanwakan, when he wakes up for 5 a.m. yoga and the volunteers have called in sick the night before for cleaning the Just a Warm Sleep space, he's like the go-to kind of person. And so like even figuring out that like, okay, so can I do yoga later today to make sure that a whole bunch of people had a warm place to sleep last night, right? Like, so just like, what is it little, is it big, is it billeting somebody, is it making a monthly donation of like your one Starbucks, like I'm going to skip Starbucks on Fridays and I'm going to donate $20 a month, and you know, and like kind of figure out what it looks like for you.
What is your vision long-term with Wakan Productions?
That is a great question. I don't know the answer.
Well, what would you like to share in terms of stories in the community? And obviously you're doing a lot of work in documentaries and showcasing people's stories. So what was the whispering?
Oh my God. All right.
This is what we do all the time. We always like, sometimes, one time I went and did a lecture for Hanwakan because he was sick. I was like, hello, I am not Hanwakan, but I have Hanwakan's notes. Anyways.
Yeah. So I think one of the key projects that we're going to work on, which we discussed over the holidays, and because we had such a fascinating experience. So like we went, my father took us out fishing when we were in Kauai Hawaii these past 2 weeks. And one day we went fishing and he caught a yellowfin tuna. And like, it's a huge thing. Like my dad's like pretty big too, and he could barely hold it up, right? And anyway, so we caught it, killed it, like took the meat off, went home later, cooked it like that same day, right? And I've never had that experience before in my life of like hunting like that.
But then we started talking with your dad, who lived on the land until he was like 8, and he's like, "Oh, this was like all the time."
Yeah, and then so APTN recently came out with an RFP, which is a request for proposals for new documentaries, and then we started talking. We're like, man, like, okay, we really like sometimes watching that show, Chopped. Like, what if there was a Chopped where you like
From kill to grill.
Yeah, what if you took people and like you had them like kill their
Hunt.
acquire acquire their meal and then have to like cook with it later. And what if we call this show like Dish, right? And like what is the experience, or how would they describe their experience of getting back to the land in that way, right? And being
so
local
take
like
urban Indigenous chefs, or like pretty urban Indigenous chefs, and then give them an opportunity to work with a guide in an Indigenous community and like take an animal's life in an appropriate and respectful way, and like follow those protocols, and then cook that food for the guide. And then eventually like the guides would get to, kind of like do sort of like a Chopped judgment, but not as intense. And then, certain cooks or chefs would move on to like a competitive round.
It sounds actually really well thought out. Have you ever thought of, or have you pitched it to a network, or thought about pitching it?
We just thought about this like last week.
we were just talking about that. Oh,
there might be something there.
Yeah, I think I came up with he came up with like that idea, and then I was like, we should call it Tradish, and then.
Now you got to do it
like
before
on
everyone
Thursday.
else
when's this
steals
going
your
out?
idea.
Right, Thursday. You got a couple of days. Put it all together.
Yeah.
But it seems like that would be a great way for people to reconnect with their identity, and then also the fact that
Solidify
it's
their current identity as a chef, right?
Exactly. And then there's a lot of different elements at play, but it seems like you could make a show out of that. So that's why it's really effective.
Yeah.
So along the same lines, is there an ideal future for Canada? What does that look like, and how will we know when we've gotten there?
For me, I think a vision for Canada is the same vision that I have for One Just City, and the same vision that our board came up with. And that's a city where all are cared for, all have a community in which they find belonging, all have enough for today and enough to not worry about tomorrow, and all are loved and working together so that more people get to be more loved. And I think that once we're there, I'll retire somehow, figure that out. But I think that that's like really key, is just that, we have enough wealth and we have enough wellness that everybody could access it if we built the systems and built up each other enough that we were making that happen.
Yeah, and I would like to see a Canada where they acknowledge like what the real social determinants of health are. So there's another good book, if you read it, it's The Social Determinants of Health.
So good.
In Manitoba. And like we often think of the social determinants of health as like, not smoking, moderately drinking, But like the real ones, it's like just having like the basic necessities and not being in poverty, right? And like there's a list anyway, and I was just like, man, like, so just not being poor is like really like where we should be headed towards, right? And like there's different ways to go about it. Like there's universal basic income, which that program just got shut down in Ontario, but it did exist here in Manitoba, right, in Dauphin. And like for all
great results.
Yeah, for the research that was done on just the program as it was, like it had great results. Like people were like, oh, like now I have the opportunity to go back to school or take other opportunities and offer something of value other than just sitting at home or just doing a job. Yeah.
Or waiting in soup kitchen lines, because the average person in poverty spends like 5 hours a day in lines.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Like that, and that's like absolute poverty, right? But like if you're eating in a soup kitchen, you're waiting in line. If you're like going to a shelter, you're waiting in line. If you're like going to see an advocate, you're waiting in line.
That's a lot of waiting.
Yeah.
I had no idea. That's a long time.
Yeah.
It's like a job, but just waiting in line.
Yeah. When you'd rather be at a job.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah,
For most
or
of them,
in some other way, right? Except I guess people who aren't in a position to work because of their physical abilities. But like, yeah. So how do we make it that it's not like a hard job to be poor, so that people have the opportunity to spend those 5 hours instead getting an education?
Yeah. Oh, and just another anecdotal example. Like for the first time in my life, I'm on EI right now, and like I'm lucky I didn't need it. Like that we were able to save enough and like.
You're welcome.
Yeah. But like I was just like, man, like because the process was so long, and to finally get some income coming, like I was like, man, if you had a family, or if I had a family, like this would be so hard, and you'd have to find other sources of help, or you'd just be super stressed out, right? And so just somewhere where we have a healthy Canada where people don't have to deal with that type of bullshit.
Yeah. I think of two different things. It's things that we've mentioned before, but it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yep.
the things that people need to have essentially every base covered and to feel like they're living a fulfilled or happy or however you want to measure it. But a fulfilled life is how I like to say it. But then I also usually share, and similar to things that have been said, and it's very yogic as well, but the physical needs of the person, the intellectual, the emotional, and the spiritual needs of each person. And so how do we fulfill those so that the holistic being is taken care of and that they can be functioning and healthy in society? So, and it seems that that's more prevalent now than ever before, and people are valuing that more than ever before. I think those things like cigarettes and whatever and how much you drink, like it's symptoms of this holistic being. And that's what came to my mind when you said that. So let's not necessarily look at the symptoms. Let's look at the whole being. What do they need to feel fulfilled? And I think that that's a way that we can progress forward healthily as a society and as a Canada too.
Perfect. Yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Sometimes there's wisdom hidden.
Yeah.
But is there any closing notes before we finish this thing off? Any other things that you wanted to share? No is a fine answer.
So I know you guys have mentioned it.
No, I got
go ahead.
No, I got nothing.
You got nothing?
No, I
Okay.
got nothing. Go ahead.
I was going to say, you've mentioned a couple times, where can we find your film production, and where can we find One Just?
Yeah, so onejustcity.ca, number one, justcity.ca. We're also on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all the same. And if you send a message to that looking for me, I will get it. And we can figure out where's the best spot for you to volunteer and make the impact you're looking for.
Yeah, and I'm just HB Whitecloud on like every, like, I have a website, HB Whitecloud. I got Facebook, HB Whitecloud, like Twitter,
'Cause
Instagram.
He took my last name as his middle name.
Oh, yeah, that's another key piece too. But maybe that's maybe the last word there. So like in Dakota tradition, like the women's are the heads of household, right? So like when I was born, like I took my mother's last name in keeping that tradition forward. But then when I was gonna get married to her, I was like, yo, I got to take your last name, yo, because it's Dakota tradition. And she was like, nah.
I'm the head of household. No.
No, she was like, no, like let's honor your indigeneity and like let's just get rid of our middle names and let's have like my last name is our middle name and your last name is our last name.
Okay.
And so that's why I'm Hanwakan Blaikie Whitecloud. Yeah. Yeah. So honoring women in that way too.
I was wondering that as well. So is there any social media for One Just City or anything
Yeah,
else?
yeah. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of it's just one, the number, Just City. You can find us that way. And then I'm Tessa Whitecloud on all of those things. But yeah, we have an event coming up actually December 30th if you want to come and plarn with us. So that's making sleeping mats out of upcycled plastic grocery bags. And so that's happening December 30th. We're going to have a sew-a-thon in January to make scarves for folks out of scraps. But then February 9th, we're doing Beat the Cold, which is Winnipeg's first winter triathlon. So it's skating, running, and fat biking. So you can try it. And it's 5 kilometers each, or you can do it as a team of 3 people and each just do one sport for 5K. And so that's all of the funds raised from that are going to help us run Just a Warm Sleep and support that program so that you beat the cold so someone else doesn't have to that night kind of idea.
Are there fat bikes for people to use in that?
Yeah,
Because
we give you a
I
fat
don't really
bike.
have access to a fat
So
bike.
you can use your own bike so long as you have good grip. And if you're doing the individual race, that's kind of going to probably be the request. But otherwise, we're going to be able to help people find fat bikes for the relay for sure.
it looked like so much fun when I saw that.
Yeah.
But no, I did want to thank you both for coming on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, like it's so great to sit down and actually have this conversation to learn about your projects, but in terms of the story and reconciliation and everything about Canada, I just thank you for coming on and sharing this time with us. So
Yeah,
You're
perfect way to
Yeah, you're very welcome. and
perfect
thank
way to
you.
go out in 2018, I think, for our podcast.
I think so too.
Hey.
Talking about Canada and in general and like the bigger scheme of things. As always, I'll do our little sign off here. So we're Be the Change. Our social media is always Be the Change YPS. I've shifted that around a little bit. You might see some differences, but we're gonna do some great things in the new year. I promise you that. The email is always if you have any information for us, or if you have any guest ideas or any content you'd like shared, email info@bethechangeYPS.com. Our website is the same name. I won't repeat it. Samething.com. And
Samething.com.
Not samething.com. BeTheChangeYPS.com.
Oh, okay.
Announcements. You might have noticed that there might be a little bit less hair on my head than last time. I went through with it. I donated
zoom
my
in
hair.
on it.
You can zoom in.
For all 2 hours of the podcast.
I donated my hair to Pantene's beautiful lengths program, not locks like I said in my Instagram video. And please subscribe on YouTube or wherever you happen to be listening to this. Thank you, Merry Christmas, and Happy Holidays out there.
Happy holidays.
Cheers.